For those of you who are not from St. Anthony's Parish, we want to welcome you from our neighboring parishes in Falmouth and in Mashpee and beyond. Normally, for those who are not here, normally we would have Stations of the Cross, but our church is right now undergoing renovations, extensive renovations. We're going to hear a lot of noise above us. Don't be alarmed, but it's coming down, not quite to the home stretch, but we're at the around the seventh inning, I'd say. So we're getting there. So excuse the noise that you might be hearing. Danny, you might want to close this door over here. That might help a little bit. So every year, around January, I start trying to think, what am I going to talk about this year? I'm running out of ideas. This is now, I don't know, the fourth or fifth year that I've been doing this. This tradition goes back to the mid-'80s, actually, when the Chowder and Chat began. And so this year, as I was kind of reflecting during January what to do, we were just beginning the project upstairs, and at the same time, as many of you know, in our Falmouth parishes, we have been beginning to work through a process of becoming a collaborative of 3 parishes, which will go into effect in July of this year. And it's an exciting time, I think, for us as a church in Falmouth, and it led me to start thinking, because we are undergoing some major changes. I mean, we can't gloss this over. It's going to be a difference. There's going to be a marked difference in the way we serve one another and work together in the Falmouth community. But this is nothing new. And I think that's the impression I hope will leave with you in these weeks of presentation, is that this has been happening to Catholics in Falmouth for well over 100 years. We're not the same church as we were years ago. And we're not going to be the same church years from now than we are now. And that's okay, because when there's movement and change, there's life. And so we keep revitalizing our way of serving the Lord, of ministering to our people as a church. And so I hope these presentations, and I was telling someone the other day, I'm not sure we're going to get 6 out of them, but the last one will just have chowder and no chat, as long as the chowder keeps going. Before I go any further, a word of thanks to the ladies, some of whom have been here since 5 o'clock for taking care of us. Many have been here since 5 in the morning. So, I mean, it's really an act of love for our community. So I'd like to begin, first of all, with our presentation is Remembering Our Past, Celebrating Our Present, and Planning for Our Future, the Catholic Community of Falmouth, which is the name of our collaborative, that you'll be hearing that name referencing our activities and life as a parish communities in Falmouth. So I want to begin basically with just some of the resources that I used. The first resource I'm very excited to mention is a book that was written about St. Joseph's Church, its history, 1882 to 1932, and it was written by the author James A. McLaughlin, and Jane is here with us today. So Jane, if you could stand and so we can see who you are. And so I'm a little nervous, just in case I don't get all the facts right, but I did particularly today's presentation, and I hope you'll be at others, but I particularly wanted Jane here with us today because today's presentation is primarily taken from her book. Also, St. Patrick's and St. Anthony's had significant anniversaries, and they came out with some very good books, memorial books. So as we go through the other parishes, that's what I used. Father Costello I don't know how many years ago this was now, I want to say probably 8-10 years ago, came out with a DVD of the history of St. Anthony's Parish, so I'll be diving into that in the next few weeks. Father Barry Wall, a historian for the diocese, wrote an excellent book for the time of the history, the 100th anniversary of the diocese, and that's Bearing Fruit by Streams of Water. And then I just went on some of our websites of our three parishes, because all three parishes have excellent history right within them. So that's where I pulled all of this from. Now, before the 19th century, we're going way back, there were no Roman Catholic churches in Massachusetts because it was illegal. It was against the law to have a Catholic church in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. All right? And I think sometimes we think we've been around forever, but actually no. Aid was given by Catholics, however, during the American Revolution, and that helped to gradually change attitudes. Although, as I was talking with Jane before today, I'm talking about, there's a book out, which I don't remember the author, called The Persistent Prejudice, a kind of a prejudice that has endured for hundreds of years in regards to Roman Catholics. And most notably, if you stop and think of the election of John Kennedy, and prior to his election, there was a big question on whether he could be loyal to the United States because he was also loyal to the Pope. So it's interesting how that persistent prejudice, I think, is still there. But anyhow, it goes back to the days that it was not allowed to have any type of religious Catholic in serving anywhere in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But in 1780, a religious freedom was granted under the Massachusetts Constitution. And soon afterwards, the Church of the Holy Cross, which is now the Archdiocesan Cathedral, was built. And in 1810, Reverend Jean Chaveris was ordained as the first bishop. He was the bishop of the Diocese of New England. The entire New England was under one bishop. So the Catholic Church was pretty young when in 1830 the first church on the Cape was built, and that was St. Peter's Church in Sandwich. It was established for Irish immigrants who worked at the nearby glass factory. It was dedicated on September 19th, 1830, and it served a whopping 70 parishioners. But as the area population grew in the late 1840s, the priest from Sandwich, listen to this now, it helps me feel a little easier. The priest was responsible for Catholics in Middleborough, Plymouth, Cape Cod, and the islands. So I'm not going to complain if I'm going to be working with 3 parishes in Falmouth. Let's go back, though, to Woods Hole. Very well-known whaling port in the 1860s, and whaling began to start winding down. And in 1863, on Penzance Point, was the Pacific Guano Company. Okay? Now, for some of you, including myself, what's guano? Well, how do I put it nicely? Have you finished eating yet? It's the excrement of seabirds. So they made a living, but it was also used as a commercial fertilizer. Okay? And so the plant was on Penzance Point. And again, it was the Irish immigrants who founded employment at the fertilizer plant in the 25 or so years of the company's operation. In 1872, soon afterwards, the Old Colony Railroad, we know that? We know it now as the bike path, but that was originally the Old Colony Railroad line, extended its line from Monument Beach all the way down to Woods Hole. Many of the railroad workers were Irish Catholics. Of course, the opening of this line also allowed access to Falmouth and was instrumental in the development of Falmouth as a resort area, but we'll get to that later. Elaborate homes were built by the rich, and once again, it brought Irish immigrants, Catholics, to work on the estates as domestic help as the Pacific Guano Company closed its doors in the late 1800s, 1880s. With a growing number of Catholics in Woods Hole, priests were sent from New Bedford, where I'm from actually, to serve the Catholics in Woods Hole. And then later in 1868, priests who were stationed in Sandwich at St. Peter's, remember that, the first church, started serving Catholics at Woods Hole. Now, in these early days, there wasn't a church. There wasn't a building. Masses were celebrated in local homes, local people's homes. But as the number of Catholics grew in New England, the Diocese of Providence was established and took in not only all of what is now Rhode Island, which is now the Diocese of Providence, but at the time also all of southeastern Massachusetts, including Cape Cod and the islands. It's Cardinal Sean, I think, that was talking to me once and said it was the biggest mistake we ever made, giving up the Cape to Providence. In the late 1870s, it became clear that Catholics in Woods Hole were in need of a church. And just as a side note, as we're listening to this, as someone who didn't come from this area, and I'm learning by reading Jane's book and other references that I mentioned, I could never figure out why did St. Joseph's, why was a church established, in my mind, so far away? But it was all because of the Irish immigrants and their working at the Guano Company. So, back to the Diocese of Providence. The first bishop there was Thomas Hendricken. And along with the pastor of St. Peter's in Sandwich, remember that? The pastor at the time there was Father Andrew Brady, not to be confused with Tom. Plans were drawn for a church to be built in Woods Hole. And the project was overseen by the new pastor of Sandwich, Father Thomas Clinton. Now, land was donated. I found this very fascinating because I walk the bike path quite a bit, and I know right to the side of the back bike path is Fay Road. Fay Road. Well, that Fay Row, I would assume, is named after a Boston businessman who is known as Joseph Fay, who interestingly was not Catholic. He donated the land for St. Joseph's Church, I would assume for the bell tower across the way. Jane, you'd think across the way as well?
His estate gave the land across where the bell tower and Mary Garden are.
Okay, so his estate did that. So the land for St. Joseph's was given by a non-Catholic businessman named Joseph Fay. And the church was built in 1881, St. Joseph's Church, and it was dedicated in honor of St. Joseph. Hold that thought for a minute. Where was the land donated by? On June 26, 1882. It's considered, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, the second oldest Catholic church building on the Cape. The first being St. Peter's.
St. Joseph was the fourth on the Cape to be built. It is currently the oldest Catholic church.
Right, because St. Peter's is no longer there. So as Jane writes in her book, while the exterior was typically New England in appearance, built of cedar shingles, she writes, on a foundation of granite, the interior is light, the ceilings and walls beautifully decorated by an Italian painter. Interestingly, the renovations upstairs are being done by a deacon of the Fall River Diocese, Deacon Tom Palanza, who's very Italian. And so we have an Italian artist upstairs who's actually with us today. We're getting some of the final things decided on. Father Cornelius McSweeney was appointed the first pastor. So that will now designate St. Joseph as a parish. He is responsible for a community, listen to this community, which extended through much of the Lower Cape, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard. He lived for a year at the same time, even though the church was established, he still lived in Sandwich. Think about this now. In those days, I guess he went by horse and buggy, you know? And imagine going over to the islands, you know? So think about that. I am, but I'm asking all of us that are involved in this collaborative to think about it next time you complain from going from one church in Falmouth to another. The distance is going to be much shorter. I don't think you're using horse and buggy anymore. Maybe a few of you, but I don't think many of you are using horse and buggy. First baptism, St. Joseph's Parish, July 20th, 1883, John Duff. First marriage, November 7th, 1883, Ann Larkin from Harwich, and Reuben Bierce from Chatham. It just, you know, I think it's a day trip to go to Chatham today. Don't you? And these people were just on horse and buggy, no less, you know. The lot near the church, St. Joseph's Church, was purchased in 1886, and the rectory was built in 1888. Because of the Catholic tradition at the time, still is to a certain extent, that a Catholic be buried in a cemetery that was consecrated, the need arose for a Catholic cemetery, since the earliest parishioners were buried in the first, that I can see, Catholic cemetery, which was in Sandwich. Once again, the non-Catholic businessman who gave land for the church, Joseph Fay, gave a parcel of land he owned on what is now Gifford Street. And that's why in the middle of the town we have a cemetery known as St. Joseph's Cemetery, which I could never figure that out. And I guess at the time that was like in the boonies on Gifford Street. So but he had that parcel of land, and once again he donated it. There's no record of this, but I wonder, once again, and it's called St. Joseph's Cemetery, if anything has to do with his namesake giving the land or giving the money for it. So, you know, as we're expanding and doing different things in Falmouth, Dick Corey, if you know, you got any extra money to spend, I might name something after you, you know. St. Richard Parish Center or something like that. You never know. In 1929, Mrs. Frances Crane Lilly, a summer parishioner, presented St. Joseph's Church with a beautiful bell tower and later developed a beautiful garden on land along the Eel Pond in front of the church, land which was also donated earlier by Mr. Fay. The tower stands of 48 feet and was constructed of granite blocks from the remains, this is interesting, of old farmhouse foundations in West Falmouth. So they were already recycling in those days, I guess. Its dedication and consecration was on July 31st, 1930, although the two bells in the tower first were rung on Christmas morning, 1929. So I guess the priest at the time just couldn't wait. As is tradition, there's often a tradition that you give a name to a bell. And those two bells have a name. One is named Mendel, after George Mendel, a scientist whose work with plants laid the foundation for modern genetics. The message on that bell, the Mendel bell, reads, "I will teach you of life and of life eternal." The other is named Pasteur, for Louis Pasteur, the father of bacteriology, and is inscribed with the words, "Thanks be to God." A garden, and I'm sure many of us have been in it, honoring the Virgin Mary was later developed. Mrs. Lilly was intrigued by the many gardens in monasteries in England with flowers named for Mary. Mrs. Lilly sought the help of Mrs. Winifred Emerson of Chicago, who was working on a book about religious symbolism in plants, to research flowers named after Mary. She found 500 plants named for Mary. The garden was designed by Dorothea Harrison of Boston. Additional plants named after saints were added to the garden. A trust was established by Mrs. Lilly and the Lilly Foundation to maintain the garden for future generations. So that's basically the story of the beginnings of the Catholic community in this particular, in the Falmouth area. And what we'll do is we'll continue in the weeks ahead. Next week, we will talk about the next church that was built after that, and that's St. Patrick's. So I hope it's kind of informative for us and help us to kind of see as we're moving forward. I think you can move forward better if you look back a little bit at the history and learn from that history. So hopefully this will help us to learn a little bit about the Catholic community in Falmouth. So thanks a lot for being with us. If you have any questions, ask Jane. Because I thank God for Jane's book, though, because 90% of this came from Jane's book. So thank you all for being with us. Again, we're sorry we don't have the Stations of the Cross. Other parishes are doing them, though, and as soon as they're done, as soon as we're done upstairs, we'll go back upstairs for the stations, which hopefully will be in about 2 or 3 weeks. So next week, same time, we'll be here at 12 noon. Okay? Thank you all very much. Oh, look at that.
Now in Portuguese. If you know how to sing it in Portuguese, sing along with us.
Oh, pode sair nesta data. You can hum.
Muitos anos We know he's given up all kinds of sweets, so he thought fruit was the best
Thank you.
way. All right?
You want to sing it in Gaelic now? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.